I took a trip to Washington, a place I'd wanted to see since I was a youngster. I planned to hang out in Seattle and stay in the city for the most part, but I decided it was only fitting to go camping in Washington's enormous forest and forests. I just intended to camp for one night before returning to the city. I'd gone camping before, but never on my own, so this was a first. I hired camping equipment from a nearby shop and discovered a tiny route with camping spots. As soon as the light came up, I drove down there and got started. The walk to the camping sites was quick and straightforward, taking me less than 3 hours. It was simply a flat area of ground with some obvious traces of prior campers, such as outdated equipment, rusted cooking pots, and rubbish. I pitched my tent out to the side, close to a tree, where there was plenty of space. As far as I knew, there were no outstanding sights to view nearby, so I was simply there to relax and unwind. At nightfall, I lit a fire and took out my Ziploc bag, which was filled with s'mores components. I created an unhealthy quantity, and when I was through, I just sat next to the bonfire and thought for a while, until I was disturbed. A guy appeared out of nowhere and sat at the other end of my campfire. "Oh, you're camping around here too?" I inquired, hoping to make the odd meeting less unpleasant. He stared at me, but didn't answer my query. I looked behind me and to the sides to check if there was anyone else present, but it was just the two of us. He rose and walked away after a few periods. I'm not sure if I was more afraid, creeped out, or bewildered, but I stayed and kept my eyes wide for the next hour. I eventually extinguished my fire and returned to my tent, staying awake for another hour before falling asleep. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by an unusual sound, the crackle of a campfire. When I opened my eyes, I noticed an orange light flickering in front of my tent. As I unzipped the tent, my heartbeat became quicker and louder. My campfire had been relit, and 4 guys sat around it, all staring at me. One of them was the same man who had stopped by before. I went out of the tent cautiously, looking at each of them in terror. Before I could say anything, one of them talked in a foreign language, and then 2 of them seized me, patting me down and grabbing my phone and wallet. There was no point in opposing these people because they were much bigger than me. They hauled me away from the campground after a thorough search. We went for almost 20 minutes into the woods, and I was choking back tears, convinced that this was the end. They then threw me to the ground, struck me over the head, and fled. They were probably attempting to knock me unconscious or daze me enough that I wouldn't follow them, but given the circumstances, it was very evident that I wasn't going to go back toward them. I stood up and began jogging in the direction I believed would lead me closer to the freeway that ran through the forest. When the adrenaline wore off, my brain hurt, and it was difficult to think clearly, not to mention that it was pitch black, and I was stumbling over fallen logs and tree roots, with no means of knowing whether or not I was traveling straight. After approximately 30 minutes of walking, I passed out. It was most likely a combination of factors, but as I regained consciousness, I realized I had even less notion of where to go. I proceeded in what I hoped was the right route, knowing there was a potential I'd become even more lost. After an hour of seeing just enormous trees and gloomy forests, I noticed a light in the distance. It was a flashlight moving about as if carried by someone. I cried for aid as I neared, only to have a man turn toward me and flash the light in my direction, followed by 3 additional men approaching behind him. I dashed away without hesitation, but they didn't appear to follow. Despite scaring the hell out of me again, I spotted the route they were walking and was able to keep moving in that direction. After 2 hours of trekking, I arrived at the highway at the crack of dawn. I finally waved down a car after another half hour and was secure from there. I got my car back after returning to the city and notifying the police, and I provided the cops with the best account of what happened. I still had to pay for the misplaced rental things, but that wasn't the worst of it. Fortunately for me, the men who stole and attacked me did not appear to be in the murdering business, but leaving me alone in such a big forest in the middle of the night gave me just a tiny chance. As strange as it seems, if I hadn't seen them a second time, as terrifying as it was, it's probable that I wouldn't be here today. I was on my way back after a job interview that took me across the country. I remained for an extra couple of days to make it a small holiday, so I drove instead of flying. Anyway, it was raining outside, which would normally make for a pleasant trip, but it was late at night, making visibility problematic. The majority of the journey was spent driving through deep woodland on long one-lane roads. The travel was intended to take around 10 hours, and I expected a minor delay due to the weather. I checked my phone soon after 1 a.m. and noticed that the next turn was 62 miles away. However, Apple Maps was guiding me on a different path than the one I'd previously followed. I didn't think it was a big deal and kept going for a long, maybe 30 minutes, before looking at my phone again. I was still 62 miles away from the next turn. When I looked closely, I noticed that my automobile was not even moving on the map. I attempted to restart the program by clicking on it, but it remained frozen on that screen. To make matters worse, it only read turn right in 62 miles, with no street or road name. Other than a hazy remembrance of a street name it had given me previously, I had no clue where I was heading or when to turn. It was one of those situations when I recognized and remembered the street sign but couldn't fully recall it on my own. Despite the inconvenience, I continued driving for a time, hoping that it was just an internet connection problem that would resolve itself once I was out of the deep woodland. After about an hour of driving, I was still in the forest, and the rain was still falling, but I noticed a crossroads coming up. On the connecting street, there was a truck parked on the side, and I assumed they were experiencing the same issue I was. I slowed down and glanced at the street sign, which, to my surprise, I thought I knew. It may have been a coincidence or a mistaken recollection caused by my lack of sleep, but I ended up turning and gambling. I felt quite secure in my decision at first, believing I had made the correct decision. But after an hour of driving, I was still in the forest. I knew I hadn't spent quite this much time driving through the forest on the way there, so something wasn't right. I checked my phone and still couldn't find anything. But up ahead, I noticed the faint glimmer of a billboard sign. A motel right in the middle of this remote woodland. It looked like a strange pick for a motel, but I parked in the parking lot to assess my position securely. There wasn't a single automobile in the lot. However, a minute later, the identical truck I'd seen at the crossroads came in and parked a few places down. Because I couldn't see much through the rain, I just ignored them and kept trying to get my phone to operate. I'd guess I sat there for around 15 minutes before giving up. A tap on my window shocked me just as I was about to go into the motel to seek help or acquire a room. He called over the rain. "Hey, can you help me?" As I inquired what he wanted, I slid the window down a bit, letting rain splash all over me. He stated he wanted instructions and gave me a specific location as if I knew where it was. "I'm sorry, guy. I'm just as bewildered as you," I said. He grimaced, then grinned and said good night as he walked back to his vehicle through the rain. I got out after a minute and dashed into the hotel. Nobody was in the front room, which was dark and deserted. I reached over the counter to see whether anyone was in the rear, but the front door unexpectedly opened behind me. When I looked around, I spotted the man from the truck outside. He was completely drenched, with water streaming from his long hair and beard. His visage was chilly and ominous, and one hand was curiously jammed in his pocket. I hurriedly attempted to move past him. He remained firmly in my path, but for whatever reason, he didn't stop me from squeezing by him and out the door. As I hurried to my car, I heard the man exiting the building behind me and his footsteps catching up with me. I got in and switched on my car just as the man approached my window, and I heard my door lock click through the rain. Thank goodness my car auto-locks, because as soon as I heard it and glanced up at him, he glared at me with strangely rage-filled eyes and began yanking on the door. He was tugging so hard that the entire vehicle rocked back and forth. I got out and drove away so quickly that I almost ran him over. I returned to the crossroads and resumed my previous route. Fortunately, after 20 miles, I arrived in a city and was able to seek assistance. The motel I was staying at had gone down a few months before, but for some reason, the sign still worked, which no one could understand. I'm not sure what that man's goals were or whether he planned the whole affair. But one thing is certain, I was incredibly lucky with my escape from that motel. Thank you very much. When I was 25, I moved out on my own for the first time. It inspired me to do new things on my own, and one thing I'd always wanted to do was go on a long trek. It may seem strange, but it was simply something I felt sounded like a good accomplishment to do on my own. I had no prior experience with outdoor activities. Thus, this was my first major hike. It was 8 hours, so I packed as much water and food as I could and went out on the journey on Monday morning. When I initially started walking, the first thing I noticed was how narrow the route was. I wasn't sure whether this was common, but it was barely broad enough to walk on without stepping on the trail's limits. Even though it was thin, it was still fairly distinct, and I knew I'd be back before nightfall, so I wasn't concerned. Although I didn't do much trekking, I was still in good enough shape to walk considerable distances. I was feeling fantastic and had no problems for most of the way up the route, but as I continued, it began to wear me down a little. I kept checking my watch, and when I was 6 hours in and still hadn't finished, I became concerned. The end of the route was supposed to be a modest overlook of the valley, so there was no way I could just stroll by it or miss it. However, according to the web page I'd visited earlier, I was 2 hours late. Then I realized that may imply the route took 8 hours to finish one way, not including the trek back. But I just knew I had to turn around at this point if I wanted to get out of the jungle before nightfall. I turned around and started walking backward. I observed a few things on the way back that I hadn't seen on the way up. There was a line of prints that ran perpendicular to the trail, from one end of the woodland to the other, and just continuing as far as I could see. I assumed it was because of a different point of view that I hadn't seen before, but I was already concerned, and this didn't help my case. The track I was going on began to broaden 3 hours into the trek back and nearly 9 hours altogether in the jungle. One thing I was certain of was that the track was narrow the entire way up, so when I noticed this, my gut nodded. I didn't know how, but I'd ended up on the wrong track, maybe by accident following a sideway. For a few minutes, I stood there like a scared child, uncertain of what to do. The light was almost lowering, and if I had made the wrong turn during the day, how could I be sure I wouldn't make the same mistake in the dark? Because I knew my options were limited, I had to go back and hope for the best. I resumed walking, but I soon noticed tracks again. They weren't the same as previously, and I knew they weren't there only 10 minutes earlier. I gazed out into the forest in their direction, but it was already too dark to see much. I soon found myself unable to see anything. The moonlight cast a faint overcast, but I hadn't brought a lamp. It was also the middle of April, so the nights would be quite chilly where I resided. The only sounds I heard as I went were my footsteps on the gravel and the murmurs generated by the trees. That is until I heard someone walking on the gravel ahead of me. I came to a halt and gazed into the darkness, but the sound faded after a few feet. I proceeded cautiously forward until I noticed footsteps in the gravel running clear across the trail. I switched on my phone light and shined it into the woods. It was still too dark, but I knew there was someone out there. "Good morning," I said. Nothing except quiet could be heard. I held my phone light motionless, and after a time I noticed a very little fog rising from behind a nearby tree from someone's chilly breath. They were only a few feet away, in the woods, but the fact that they were hidden made me wonder what they were up to and why they didn't want to be seen. I swiftly continued down the route, and after 30 minutes I discovered where I had inadvertently turned off. I finally made it out and reached my car some hours later. For weeks following that, I hated myself for putting myself in such a dreadful situation, but it just grew worse. I believe it was 3 weeks after the trek that I learned on the news that 2 bodies had been discovered in the woodland where I had gone. They didn't offer specific places, although it was close to the trail I had followed. I don't think they found out who did it, but I'm fairly certain I was just 10 feet away from them at one point, near enough to see their chilly breath in the dark.